we have done our presenting. We're about an hour in, and now it's your turn to ask questions. Provide your perspective, discuss best practices, anything that's worked for your office or your project that you'd like to share. We, as usual, have a few questions that we're going to start with that we've gotten from you over the past couple months. And don't forget that you're going to hear from 3 contractors after the Q&A period, so be sure to stick around for that because you will not be disappointed in that. All righty. The first question is, I think this one especially is for Cindy. How do we deal with poor performing contractors, and what can we do when they are third-party contractors? And Chris, I don't know if you've heard these questions much yet, so.
Well,
you want to start?
I'm going to start.
Okay.
Just like I talked about, we do have a few options in the direct contracting process. First, document all the facts. Then talk with your contractor, and if necessary, get your contracting officer involved, because there are a few contractual ways that we can nudge the contracting officer or the contractor along. If that doesn't remedy it, then we can go for a little bit more aggressive solution.
Okay.
And I'll speak to the third-party aspect.
Okay.
So in third-party contracts, the contract is held between the proponent and the contractor. So the BLM doesn't really have a formal mechanism for driving or responding to performance issues. So really the only remedy for us is to work with the proponent to see if they can leverage the contractor, and it really underscores the importance of maintaining frequent communications with the contractor throughout, having a strong statement of work, and if all else fails, hopefully you've developed a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, with the proponent that allows for some sort of dispute resolution. And dispute could even go so far as to include performance issues with the contractor that they've hired.
Chris, do you want to add anything to that, or?
Sure. So as far as poor performance, I guess I come back to the question we've asked in the past broadcasts. Is it really poor performance? Take a look at the statement of work. What were the expectations? The fact that it's not presented in a way we like, or maybe in the manner or style we like, doesn't necessarily mean that we can say it's poor performance if they met the terms of the contract. Maybe, let's be sure that it wasn't us not articulating what we wanted to see first. And then if that is the case, and it was pretty clear in the statement of work, then definitely go forward and say, we missed the bar, and what are we going to do to fix it?
Okay. All right. And as you're still gathering your thoughts out there in the field, we'll catch another question. I'm not sure where these are from, because we got these from, like I said, a couple months ago when you asked us these. So, under what circumstances would we terminate a contract? And this one is probably Cindy?
Yep. Well, Kathy, and I think I've talked to Chris and Molly about this quite a bit. Ideally, termination is the last resort. There's 2 different types of termination. There's termination for default, which is error on the contractor, or poor performance, or not meeting schedules, or there's a few other things financially that fall into that. The other type is for convenience, and the government has a lot of leeway in that one. But ultimately, in my career, I've only terminated 2 contracts, and that was usually mutually agreed upon by the government and the contractor, to where it was a benefit to the contractor due to they maybe overextended themselves or something like that, or back to the government, we just didn't need that service any longer. We thought we did. We don't have the crystal ball, so we just said, let's stop right now. No harm, no foul.
Do you have anything to add to that, Molly? Or Chris, do you have any thoughts? No? Okay.
No.
All right, and kind of along those same lines, and this might be fairly appropriate for what we're going through now with the sequestration. The question is, how do you effectively mothball a contract so that it can be picked up again at a later date? And first, if you could define what mothball is.
Sure, I'll take a
ahead.
stab
Okay.
at this one. So we've heard this question a lot, kind of around the water cooler in our offices. Well, what's going to happen to such and such project if the budget's cut or if we can't hire summer seasonals? So mothballing is kind of this idea of putting a project on hold and just letting it sit kind of in a holding pattern indefinitely until we have either the budget or the staff to finish it off. So if you're faced with having to mothball a project, there's two tips I would recommend. One is look for the next most logical point in your project. Like what's a logical conclusion at which point to mothball. If you're right in the middle of alternatives development, maybe you want to see the alternatives development through to the end of that task and then kind of can it at that point. So look for a logical point at which to mothball. The second tip I would offer on this, and it's similar to what we discussed with the administrative record, is to create a README file. If you think you're going to have to put a project on hold, it would really behoove you if the project manager or someone who's been closely involved with the project could develop some sort of brief memo basically explaining what's been completed up to date, what are the critical tasks that remain, was there anything still pending that you couldn't resolve at the time you had to mothball it. Just kind of the best way to describe it is that memo, so that 2 years from now, when somebody else picks up the project, they get a clear picture of where you were at the time the project went on hold.
That's a good answer. I'm going to add some caveat to that, Kathy. First of all, I think it's situational. There's a lot of reasons that we could get to the mothball point. I try not to get there because there's, on the contractor's side, they could actually charge us for work that they've anticipated, people they've hired. A few financial issues could arise. If we need to do that, once again, I think good communication with the contractor, because they know, they read the news, they're well aware of, we may not have the money or the funds to either complete the project or really add to it as we anticipated to do it perfectly or, all the way through. So just communication, keep the lines open, things like that.
And one final minor point on this, it's relevant to what we discussed earlier with the administrative record. If you are faced with having to mothball a project and you're working with a contractor, make sure you get all of the records that have been generated up to that point before you put that contract on hold, before you make it dormant.
That's a good point, because we've paid for those records to that point, and the government has the ownership to those.
Is there anything you want to add, Chris, to that?
Yeah, I'd like to just really quickly add on what Molly was saying. One of the things that it may be useful to think about is don't assume that the team that's working on it now will be the one to pick it up in the future, and don't assume, just kind of don't assume that it will go forward the way you might think it will. Plan for it to be pretty much easy to pick up by anyone at any time, and maybe consider having some kind of a review or sign off by whatever the next level of review, management, state office, Washington, whatever it is, kind of a preliminary review to put in writing so that when you pick it up, you know that everybody in the chain had agreed that we did a good enough job to this point, so now we can just pick up and move forward and not have to step back a few steps before continuing.
So Cindy, I have a question about this. If, let's say you do mothball a project and it's been whatever, months, I don't know about years, and then you want to start it up again, do you have to develop a whole new contract?
That's yet to be seen, Kathy.
Oh, okay.
We don't have some real clear direction. Once again, I think it's communication with your contractor and the government of what they can forecast. But right now, if it's based on our current scenarios, we don't have real good direction on how to stop and restart something, because then it gets into appropriation law issues of how the money flows.
Right, okay.
Good question.
All right, so to be continued. And so just in case anybody's still watching out there, because you're all so quiet, we only have 2 more questions that we gathered from all the questions you've asked us in the past. So If we don't hear anybody, I'm going to assume that we have covered everything so clearly that you have no questions, which I'm not sure if that's the case. But we'll go through these 2 questions, and if there isn't anything else, even though we have plenty of time, we will just move to our contractors that we have. So you have a few more minutes to chime in. All righty, so the next question we have, after all parties feel the contracted document is complete, what leverage can the BLM use to make sure we receive all the deliverables, like the metadata, for the record? Okay, so you got that.
I'm going to let Chris start with that one.
Did you hear that one, Chris?
So what leverage do we have to make sure that we've got all of the documents we need?
Yep, all the deliverables.
So, I guess it really comes down to, as a core, I'm the one certifying and saying that we've received the services we were supposed to have received. And so, before signing that invoice, one of my questions to the team is going to be, did we get everything we were supposed to get? Other than that, make sure that it's clearly spelled out in the contract, make sure the statement of work is reasonable and we articulate what we want, and do that well ahead of time. Don't wait until contract closeout to suddenly say, oh, I didn't know, but we really want X, Y, and Z. I think it's in our best interest to be clear up front all along about what X, Y, and Z are going to be, and to periodically remind the contractor that, hey, before we close this out, we're going to need copies of all this stuff. What format are we getting them in? Answer those questions ahead of time so it doesn't become a back and forth as we're trying to get the final invoice paid.
Yeah, and I know one thing that I've done is, you kind of said this, Chris, but I won't sign off on the invoice unless I have everything. And we also structure the payments so that the bulk of the payments comes towards the end, so that they have more incentive to get everything done and get us all the documents.
Good point, Kathy. Depending on how your contract is structured, we can withhold payment. We can do a few creative things at the end, but I think in this industry, I've found that most all contractors want to get this right because it impacts them for the future and it impacts the environment.
Okay, so thanks, Kim. We got a fax from Kim, and she has a comment more than a question. She says, it's excellent to know the flexibility with contract modifications, and inherently planning processes are iterative and dynamic, and we can anticipate many issues and address in the statement of work, but inevitably unexpected issues may arise, as we all know that have worked on planning documents, and being able to work with the contracting officer to address these situations and still stay on track is critical. So yeah, that's a good comment, Kim. Thank you. All righty, so our last question is unless nobody else had anything to add to that? Okay. So what does the BLM consider appropriate penalties or consequences for nonconformance to the contract schedule and deadlines? Who wants to start with this one? Do you want to start, Cindy?
I'll take this one first.
Okay.
Well, to my knowledge, there's no set penalties. If you write your contract a certain way, then there is a little bit more, we can input a certain percentage. Like say, if we're not happy with it, we cut 10%. It can either be the last year, the last whatever portion. But to my knowledge, there's not a set penalty. There's a lot of things that we have latitude to do, but once again, I want to stress that make sure that our ducks are in a row, because when you start withholding money from a profit-driven company, they're going to bring out their big guns, and they're going to have every email, everything laid out there, and they're going to show that they attempted to make it right. So, I mean, we do have some hidden ways to get their attention.
And I know from my experiences, you were alluding to it, I've never seen it where it's always purely the contractor's fault. A lot of times it's partially our fault why the schedules are delayed and situations, and like Kim was saying, a lot of these contracts are so complicated with planning processes, things you can't anticipate. So would you suggest that we just modify the contract and modify the dates?
Usually it's a matter of getting one's back on track to the schedule point of why, okay, draw a line in the sand is how I like to say it, Kathy. Okay, that was the past. We all know our roles now. Let's move forward. And I'm going to say that usually works.
Chris or Molly, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. I think what Cindy said is dead on about drawing a line in the sand. Think of the amount of work you put into getting the contract put together, getting the statement of work written, all of the time and effort that went into bringing this contractor on board. And if it's a 4 to 5 year RMP contract, I'd be really hesitant to take any drawing lines in the sand action I didn't have to. I think my first thing would be to try to resolve it, working with the contractor. What were those expectations? To me, kind of the punishment type situation or the penalty type situation really is the last resort. I know as Cindy mentioned, like penalty costs and liquidated damages are typically not allowed in contracts, and so we don't see those. But it's really rework or getting the team together to solve the problem more than getting into a situation where it's just punishment oriented. And I think we all agree we don't want to have to go through the contracting process again if we can avoid it.